Brought to you by ExpressCare Health and Skin Center. Get in, get out, get better.
Welcome back to Healthy Living, everybody. We are talking about the hip, and Dr. Jitka Lom, the principal physician at ExpressCare, some of the nicest physicians and nurses assistants, I may say, are in your employ. Really, really nice. They provide
I do have great staff.
Yeah, they are absolutely phenomenal for anything
Kisses
you want to do. Excellent. What a way to start off the new year. Okay, so we've already talked about the hip being a ball and socket joint. Can we talk about maybe some of the more mechanics of the hip and maybe even some of the anatomy of it?
Oh, well, your femur, that's the big bone of your thigh, enters into the pelvic bone, which, of course, is lined with a little bit of cartilage in the socket section. We call that the labrum. So you have the femur that fits into that cavity.
I hear about the labrum, like a lot of football players like have that because, you know, the violent nature, or hockey players.
Exactly,
you know,
hockey and football.
From your native Canada.
Yeah, and rugby, where they basically have an injury to the side. They fall on their side. They have enough power there, enough impact that there's some shearing of the cartilage there, and basically a small tear in that cartilage.
How about for people like who, for a living, you know, they may play professional sports where, you know, like where what they do is there's a natural breaking. I mean, they're very, very, very fit, but the fact that they're always running or they have these violent collisions, or even maybe people that like, you know, they lift a lot of heavy objects for a living, or, you know, people that work, soldiers perhaps, or construction workers.
Heavy loads.
Yeah. What types of hip injuries do you see common with people like that?
Well,
as opposed to office workers.
Right. So eventually what happens is basically there's a lot of wear and tear there, and the process that happens in the hip joint is that basically the cartilage gets worn down and thin, and there may be areas of it where it's completely missing, and so then you'll have the two bones rubbing on each other and create inflammation in there and swelling and pain, and then you may even get little spurs that occur on the socket part. So then you've got sort of bony spurs, bone rubbing on bone, cartilage not present or thinner, and you know, there's a lot of discomfort and stiffness, and that's one of the main qualities of hip pain when it's severe and ongoing, is that there's tremendous stiffness in the morning. It may take about an hour for that person to kind of lube up, warm up their hip socket. Yeah.
Now I am a former athlete, and I was by no means, you know, like, you know, a very good one and everything, but I did play sports a lot when I was young. Now I'm in that office worker, you know, mentality, so I do a lot of sitting, even though we walk around a lot here in Harmon. But I've noticed sometimes that my hip will have a tendency to click. Maybe not like my neck or, you know, like my that whole thing.
Wow. Oh, that was good.
I wasn't expecting it to be that good, but, you know, like my back and everything. My hip clicks, and in a very distinct way. Why is that?
Clicking of any joint is due to the release of nitrogen, usually nitrogen gas in the joint. So you may hear a little pop or a click from that. As far as other reasons why, sometimes because of the mechanics, the way that the hip or any joint, the hip is moving, you may have some tendon slippage around there as well, where it sort of like goes, and then gives. And the give feels like a click sometimes. You can actually hear it sometimes, though, if it's the nitrogen.
Yeah, I can kind of hear it inside my head, and like not everybody else hears it. Well, here's, not to inject myself into the story because that's bad journalism practice, but I and a lot of people I know are double jointed in our hips. So like we can do like weird stretches and everything like that.
Really?
How common is that, and will that lead to, am I avoiding potential hip problems later on in life, or does that make me even more candidate for that?
So what you're talking about when you say double jointed is really extreme flexibility, and so this is really helpful if you're a gymnast or you know, a dancer, because then you have tremendous flexibility in your hip joint. That does not give you a higher likelihood of getting arthritis in the hip unless you also have something called laxity, meaning that you don't have a lot of muscular support. But in general, flexible people are just as likely to get arthritis as those who are less flexible.
That's very interesting. Now, you know, I know people that believe that, you know, they're double jointed and everything. These are the ones that, you know, the contortionists that can put their their legs behind their head and everything.
It's really more a question of wear and tear, how much you're using that joint, how heavy the loads are that you're loading it with.
And again, it does help to like stretch it out before you're doing like strenuous work.
Definitely. Stretching is really helpful before and really important after any exercise that you do, because at the beginning your muscles are not warmed up, they're kind of cold, they're not going to stretch as well, and then after the exercise your muscles have warmed up, so that's really the perfect time to stretch them, is at the end.
Now if I am feeling discomfort in my hip, is there anything that I, ignoramus that I am, can I tell, how can I tell, I should say, between what is a problem with one of my muscles and actually something wrong with the hip joint itself?
That's a great question. And here's another important thing is that hip pain is sometimes referred from the knee. We say referred meaning you may feel it in your hip, but your problem's really in your knee. And this is very, very, very common. And so people say, oh, my hip is sore, but eventually when we check it out, it's actually coming from their knee. And the same can happen from the lower back. So you may feel pain in the hip, but it's actually coming from the sciatic nerve or from the lower back actually itself. So this is something that your doctor will sort out. But a good question to ask to figure that out is how you feel when you get up out of a chair. And if you're finding that you're sitting in the chair and you're really okay, but you get up and then you have a lot of pain in the hip, then it's probably your hip. Knee pain can sometimes mimic that, but that's one way we try to figure it out.
That's very interesting. Okay, I want to talk about hip dysplasia for a moment. Just saying the word sounds way so much like hip displacement and everything like that, which
no, and that's different.
Which as an athlete like really terrifies me.
Oh boy. Well, hip dysplasia is something that is congenital, meaning that children are born with that. And we check for it at their infant visit. When they come in for their 2-month and 4-month checkups, we check the child's hip joints to see if they click or pop and see if they're stable. Because when you're born, you should have already pretty stable hip joints. Like we're talking about the laxity, sometimes there's not enough muscular and tendon support around there, and then the hip will kind of be a little too loose. So another situation, well, what will happen over time if your hip is too loose is that it will kind of be jiggling in the socket when you're walking and so on, and you'll develop early arthritis. So if that's not picked up in a child, they may have arthritis by the time they're 20 years old.
Will people like that develop like a very noticeable limp?
They might have a limp, and they may also require what you were talking about, the hip replacement surgery, much, much sooner.
Okay, well, real quick before we go to our commercial break now, is hip dysplasia also the same thing? Because I know some people have like very microscopic imbalances in the length of their legs.
Oh, and that's so important too, leg length discrepancy. And that's partly due to posture and partly due to heredity and the way you're born, that your two legs may be a little bit of a different length. And then if you're walking around, you're always kind of leaning just a little bit to one side. It may not be obvious to other people, but enough that you're always loading the one side more than the other side. And then what happens over time is that one side will have more wear and tear over years and years and years. You develop arthritis in one hip. So if that happens, then what we can do is even out the leg length discrepancy. Chiropractors can help with this, physical therapy can help with this, and also just putting a little lift in your shoe so that the two legs end up at the same length.
Well, taking care of your hip, as is taking care of your life, is pretty much all about balance.
Yes, that's true. Very nice.
All right, well, Doc, thanks
True
so
story.
much.
Thank you.
All right, and we are going to